Hello, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our film. काफ़ी दिलचस्प फिल्म थी. मेरा नाम ज़हरा नकवी है. मैं जो हूँ एक फिल्म एडिटर हूँ, दुबई में बेस्ड हूँ, और मैं डॉक्यूमेंट्री एसोसिएशन पाकिस्तान की टीम मेंबर भी हूँ. डॉक्यूमेंट्री एसोसिएशन पाकिस्तान, जैसे आपको पता होगा, अगस्त से हमारा चलता फिरता फिल्म फेस्टिवल जारी है, जहां हम कोशिश करते हैं कि ऐसी डॉक्यूमेंट्री फिल्में आपको दिखाएं जो पाकिस्तानियों ने बनाई हों ख़ास तौर पे. और हम एक ज़ुलसानी इदारा हैं, मतलब वॉलंटियर रन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, और हमारा एम है कि डॉक्यूमेंट्री फिल्म मेकिंग और डॉक्यूमेंट्री फिल्म मेकर्स को जिस तरह से भी हम प्रमोट कर सकते हैं करें. मेरे साथ अभी शहरज़ाद महर मौजूद हैं. इन्होंने जो है हमारी ये जो अभी आपने फिल्म देखी बनाई भी है, एडिट भी की है, शूट भी की है. शहरज़ाद महर जो हैं वो एक इंटरडिसिप्लिनरी आर्टिस्ट हैं जो कराची में पली बढ़ी. इन्होंने विजुअल आर्ट्स बेनिंगटन कॉलेज से पढ़ा, बैचलर्स किया अपना, है ना, बेनिंगटन कॉलेज से, और इन्होंने मास्टर्स किया है फाइन आर्ट से फ्रॉम येल यूनिवर्सिटी. ये अमेरिका में रहती हैं, फिलाडेल्फिया में, और इनका वर्क जो है और इनकी फिल्में बहुत सारे इंस्टीट्यूशंस और फेस्टिवल्स पे स्क्रीन हो चुकी हैं, और बहुत सारी पब्लिकेशंस इंक्लूडिंग साइट एंड साउंड, आफ्टर इमेज और पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू ने इनके काम के बारे में लिखा है. तो शहरज़ाद, थैंक यू सो मच, आपने टाइम निकाला.
Thank you.
एंड थैंक यू सो मच फॉर दिस फिल्म. आई थॉट इट वाज वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग. बहुत एक यूनिक फिल्म थी और बहुत कुछ इसमें सोचने को मिला, देखने को मिला. सबसे जो इंटरेस्टिंग बात मुझे लगी वो ये थी कि ये अपने ऑडियंस को पैसिवली नहीं ट्रीट करती. मतलब मैं जब देख रही थी, आई फेल्ट कि मुझे कॉन्स्टेंटली देखना पड़ रहा था, समझना पड़ रहा था कि क्या हो रहा है, या लिंक्स क्रिएट करने पड़े थे. आप बैठ के, आपको बताया नहीं जा रहा होता कि ये फिल्म किस चीज़ के बारे में है, अब आप क्या सोचें, अब आप क्या महसूस करें. तो ये बात मुझे काफ़ी अलग लगी फ्रॉम अ लॉट ऑफ फिल्म्स जो हम देखते हैं. अच्छा, तो मेरा पहला सवाल आपसे होगा कि आपका, जब आप ये फिल्म बनाने जा रही थी, आपका स्टार्टिंग पॉइंट क्या था? मतलब आपने सोचा था कि फर्स्ट रिस्पॉन्डर्स पे बनाएं फिल्म, या आपने ये सोचा था कि यू वांटेड टू कि वायलेंस के ऊपर बनाएं, ट्रॉमा के ऊपर? मेंस शुरू से ही आपका यही इंटेंशन था? जस्ट कैसे ये इनिशियल आइडिया से अभी जो फिल्म बनी है उसमें इवॉल्व कैसे किया?
Right. So my practice came like at that point from studio art, and that was like mostly my background, visual arts. And I sort of think of the process of arriving at the ideas for the film a little bit like a studio practice, which, you know, when you're an artist, you follow like multiple threads of like inquiry and curiosity. You have different things up on your wall. Some things work out, some things don't. Some projects go on for a really long time. And it's a little bit different from like film done in a more like capital F film sense, where, you know, you have like a script and then you execute it, and there's like a whole like, you know, there's steps that are prescribed and you have to follow them and then produce it. And I wasn't aware of that really. So it started with me just being curious for a really long time about ambulance drivers. Like I grew up in Pakistan, and I think like anybody, like I still remember like my chest tightening when ambulance sirens would start, you know, screeching like on the street and nobody moving. I think for a while, like I've been fascinated by how precarious their labor is. They're so undercompensated, and yet the city is so dependent on them. And they're also like these sort of walking, talking encyclopedias of the city. You know, like we know the city in sometimes in theory, or we've been a few places here or there, and we have like stories from different points in time, but they have a very tactile experience of the city in a way that I think is not comparable to any other job. So that I was sort of curious about that, but I didn't want to like do this sort of film where I was following them on a mission and like on an adrenaline rush, you know, like, oh, we got a call, we're going to go get this body. And so that was kind of sitting in my head for a while. And completely separately, I was also interested in the reenactment actors. And it was only later when I was editing that it became apparent that the material is actually much more interesting when you kind of make them ping pong off each other. And also, when I was talking to Ayub, while I was, like going on these sets and filming these reenactment actors, he was just, because sometimes we would just chat, and he just said, "Oh, what else are you up to? Like, what are you doing?" And I mentioned that I was going on these sets, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I know that. Like, I go there sometimes, and I play an ambulance driver." And I was like, "What?" Like, there's like that moment where you just like never thought of that connection. I thought those were actors. You just sometimes see ambulance drivers come in and they have a stretcher and they take the body away, but I thought those were actors. And so then I realized, like, wow, he's not paid for it, but Chipa kind of like agreed, like, okay, we'll send you, and because it's just a lot easier. We already have our uniform. They come in, it's usually just a few seconds. They like put a Band-Aid on. There's a scene in the film about that, and then they go off. So that was sort of like the catalyst. And then from there, I didn't want to make a film that had like a plot or that was like character driven. So that it became apparent that like I wanted to make something that had the material kind of talking to each other in like less obvious ways, but yeah, in the ways that you're talking about, like just these different connective tissues started forming between the material.
Okay. Also, on a completely side note, so when you found out that Ayub was going to these film sets, do you have or these reenactment sets? Do you have any idea like what his motivation would have been? Because it sounds like a very traumatic. Did you ask him that? Because
I don't think like part of like them being able to do their jobs is also that they don't think about their trauma too much or things that are potentially what we imagine would be triggers. So it really wasn't like a big deal. They're not paid for it, but that wasn't, I think it's just also the power dynamic of Chiba saying who's available, who's going to go, and that's your boss and you listen to them. And it's not like he thinks he's going to become like a TV star by going on these sets, and that's his motivation. So I think he just gets asked. He's also somebody who has been working there for a long time. So yeah, I think it's just like a more informal thing. And it was incredibly boring for him because he described how he had to like often just sit for really long periods, and then he was just in the scene for like 2 seconds. So it's not very exciting work.
Yeah, which is very different from how these reenactment scenes are then depicted and are shown and are shot, right? Because there's like extra drama added to them, and
right.
Just the way that they're shown was very different from how the interviews were and how like the first respondents would be talking about their sort of experiences was very kind of toned down, was shown on top of still images or them kind of cleaning the tire or doing mundane tasks as opposed to the reenactments. So how do you feel like these two things sort of feed off each other, or like was this a contrast you were trying to create by deliberately placing kind of more still silent images on the actual stories and actual experiences as opposed to constructed ones?
So I think one thing that was interesting to me was when I was, because before I went with a camera, I kind of just hung out at their headquarters and talked with them. And what was interesting is before I fully fleshed out what it is that I wanted to do, which was like a request that can we go to your house and do this interview. And they thought I wanted to film something about Chipa, and Chipa was nervous about that. So they were a bit like, what are you doing? And I was like, don't worry, I'm not, this is not going to be interesting to you at all. It's about the ambulance drivers, not the organization. And one interesting thing was Ayub and Marceline were like, oh, like come with me to the morgue, like I'm gonna be doing this, and come with me on this mission. I'm gonna be, and they had all these ideas of what the film should look like. And it's actually kind of amazing how much people like are quite familiar with like cinema verite filmmaking and like what it is that they think you should do to make it look real or to make it look like you're a fly on the wall. So they were actually directing me for a while, and they thought that I would be interested in like filming a dead body, or like like seeing them on a mission, like in a really gory scene, and it was an act of generosity. It's like, look, when I'm doing this, like I'll invite you and come with me. And I just that's not very interesting to me, because I think I wanted in the time that I had with them and the privilege that I had to sort of steal time from their schedules, I wanted to just sort of like create stillness. That's not something that also like they really kind of have. They have like 30-hour schedules, like nonstop, and then when they're home they mostly sleep and then they go back to work. And so I wanted to just sort of like have details emerge from like stillness, which is so contradictory to like the general rhythm of their life. And with the reenactment actors as well, there's like this like hyper steroidal like production, like it's like very manufactured, and the end result is just like, go. And I wanted to also not do that. I didn't want to show that. That wasn't interesting to me. I wanted to show the gaps and how they're filled, so like moments when they're waiting. There's a lot of waiting in both the worlds, like actually and it's tense in the ambulance driver's world, but a lot of it is just like waiting to be called on a mission, and to capture those moments where in both worlds these characters are just waiting and preparing, and they have their rituals and their ways of dealing with like the restlessness and sometimes the boredom, and then it just goes from like 0 to 100 and there's like action, so there's that. And I think also like as an interviewer or somebody who's making a film, you also have to, for me, like figure out like more interesting ways to like explore their interiority. And I just don't think that going to their workplace, for example, and asking them about their work would produce very interesting results, because they are very on guard there. Like you can feel like the tension in their bodies, like it's a physiological, like conditioned thing in order to do their jobs. That's sort of like how it is. And also like they're around their peers, and so there's a little bit of like the kind of machismo of appearing a certain way, and you're just not going to get anywhere if you ask someone about their dreams in their like headquarters. So just sort of like problem solving, like I know this is what I want to do, but how do I like make them feel like they can actually answer that question, So it's partly problem solving. And then I think of like films also, at least what I aspire to, and the films that I love, they're like poems. So they're not necessarily like about plots or how things directly connect, but how briefly like two scenes will sort of in the beginning not make any sense as part of the same thing, and then they'll just sort of like shoot off these signals to each other, and this sort of like alchemy starts forming, and what one viewer sees like is sometimes completely different from what another viewer sees. It's not like, oh, did you get that plot? And yes, I got it, and I got it. It's just a little bit more like this fragile kind of chemistry that is sometimes elusive, but there are these connections that are made and new meanings that are produced. And so there were just similarities that I like when I'm editing, it's like it's often by color or by sound or by feeling or an emotion. So sometimes you'll see moments where there's this big bravado and display of masculinity in like the audition scenes, and then you have Ayub who presents a very like soft, vulnerable moment where he talks about his mother. So like how those two things kind of like appear when they're put together. Yeah.
Achha, so what stood out to me was कि जब आपने कहा कि you focus on also the waiting around and the moments जो उनकी job के या when something जब वो लोग कुछ violent experience कर रहे होते हैं, not वो वाले moments but maybe moments before and after that. Similarly with the reenactments also when they're kind of waiting around.
Yeah.
So it's also then in a sense about how these people try to understand, grapple with, and take in kind of the trauma and the violence that they face or that they are told to act out, perhaps. So for the first respondents, do you think कि फिर आपने जो dreams के बारे में पूछा, and a lot of their responses were about their personal trauma, about their seeing their mother, या अपने बेटे को जो end में वो अपने dream के बारे में बात करते हैं. तो perhaps do you think that was also their way of like maybe dealing with what they experience kind of through their own maybe personal trauma?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's also like maybe
Like, how does a dream kind of, I'm just curious about how the role that the dreams play in the
yeah.
film or in their lives, yeah, according to you.
Yeah, I think like while doing this, I didn't want to sometimes attach too much symbolism to it, because I do have the privilege as someone like who like lives now in the West and has some idea of like Western therapy and like ideas about mental health and like trauma and what and a language around that and a vernacular around that, and maybe subconsciously then when I internalize it, I behave in certain ways, and they just don't have that. And that's because, like, and so projecting onto them like, too much of like this dream is a stand-in for that. I think that you can have those dreams and still not really be reckoning with, your trauma. Like that's not necessarily one and the same. So they did articulate certain things, but I don't think like I can take that to mean that they are having they may be, but it just isn't to me, like, especially with like post-traumatic stress disorder, like you can have like the most deep, intense dreams and even think about it later, but you're not necessarily like metabolizing it. So I didn't want to project too much like symbolism onto that. I also think there's also something interesting that happens as an artist when you go to people and sometimes if you're not, well, first of all, like if you when I've gone to certain people that I've wanted to interview or talk to in my other work as well, the first thing they ask me is like, are you a journalist? And I was like, no. And it's like, okay, do you work for a TV channel? And they want to know what TV channel that might be. And they when they find out that you're an artist and actually the thing that you want to talk to them about is something really low stakes, the direction kind of changes, and in a weird like upside down way, because it's not a serious thing. Like I want to ask you about your recurring dreams. It kind of makes them start taking it seriously because there's less of that performance involved of like, sometimes I think they're also very smart, and people sometimes know like what is being asked of them by reporters, and there's a performance of like the information given back. And so when they see that like you're coming to them with a genuine question, they start sort of I think just taking it like there was less artifice involved in like how they kind of gave that information to me, and so that was kind of a like interesting discovery, because it is like a tall order to ask someone about that kind of thing. And I also with this film, I wasn't in their lives for a long time, and I'm interested in like this potential sometimes to meet total strangers and ask them about or to reveal really intimate information and be more vulnerable than you might be with like a family member or somebody you've known for like 20 years, like how that comes to be, because that does happen with me sometimes. And how you might be able to do that in an interview. Those were kind of like things that I was thinking about.
Okay. Acha, we have a question from one of our viewers, Mustaqim. And उन्होंने पूछा है कि how long did filming and editing take?
So I filmed this in late 2015. And then it premiered in February 2018. Anyway, it took a long time. It shouldn't have taken as long as it took, but I had a job. I also like was coming kind of very directly from like the visual arts world, and I had no idea, like it was becoming evident that this would not really work in like one of those white cube scenarios, or like like video art tends to generally be shorter, and that this was kind of gravitating more towards the film world, but I had no idea like how that world functions. So a lot of it was just sort of like, oh, there's like feature films are 60 minutes and short films are this, and apparently you're supposed to do this before you do this. So, and also teaching myself things like, because I couldn't afford hiring people to do it. So that all took much longer than it should have. But yeah, that's like 3 years.
Right. सही. और एक और सवाल है by Rashida Muqaddam. वो पूछती हैं, what kind of the kind of questions that you asked in the interview, were they surprised or weirded out by it? Like, were they surprised that you're not asking them about their work and are asking about their dream? I think you touched upon this a little bit. Lekin, just kind of reactions to the sort of questions that you were asking.
Yeah, I did tell them, that I wanted to ask them about recurring dreams, and then I went back the next day. So I didn't want to say that and then give them a month to sort of like think about it. But I wanted to give them enough time that like, okay, just so you know, like this is the thing I'm really interested in. And a lot of the really interesting material comes like after the first, I would say, especially with Marceline, after the first like 20 minutes to half hour, because in the beginning, I think it's just the awkwardness of being in front of a camera, being with this woman in a room, no one else is there, the camera is like, and just kind of like in the beginning, I think, especially Marceline, he gets asked a lot to deal with the media when they have questions or want to do an interview. So he had these like bites of information that it was so evident, like he's gone through this like script of like, what to say about Chipa, like almost as if like Chipa was listening in and like monitoring him, So it took a while to like get that over with. And then, in both the interviews, the very last thing they talked about was actually like the dreams. I think it just took a while to get there. So there's that. And I also didn't ask a lot of questions, which, I think made like Ayub was really happy about that, because he's like this like free associator. He's just such a storyteller, and he just kind of went with it after a while. Marceline, like there were like a few questions here and there. And I think also sometimes there's this like idea that as an interview, and especially if you're like working on a documentary film, and especially if you're a woman, that you need to put a subject at total ease and they need to look completely comfortable. And even if you have to embed yourself in a community for 100 years, it should look like it's natural. And I sometimes think that when things are uncomfortable, because the reality is that you're coming from a different class, you have different privileges than them, like empathy has its limits, right? And sometimes when you show where those boundaries are and sometimes that gives rise to awkwardness, that can actually say more. And be a little bit more truthful than just trying to cover it up. So I am interested in moments of clumsiness and moments where I do make them uncomfortable or they make me uncomfortable. I don't necessarily think like that's to be edited out. Those can be quite revealing, because both of us have a place in the world and move through the world differently. And I'm not just like a fly on the wall, like filming them. So there was awkwardness in the beginning, and I think that's fine.
And is that also maybe the reason you chose to then keep, जैसे वो पानी पीने की बात करते हैं, पूछते हैं, तो वो भी पूरा फिल्म के अंदर है कि वो उठे, पानी पिया, पूछा, इस तरह के decisions जो आपने लिए हैं, which you don't often find part of like a documentary interview where you're, the subject kind of gets off, starts doing something else.
Yeah, I think that there are like moments where people like handle it in different ways, and that's kind of interesting to me. Like Marceline asked a lot, like, are you sure that sound's not going to disturb us outside? I'm like, it's fine. You can
but you chose not to edit it out,
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are details in there that I find compelling as a filmmaker. Yeah.
Acha, we have another question from Shumaila. How did you choose the main characters? Were they suggested to you, Ayub especially?
Yeah, they were suggested. You don't really have much, at least where I'm coming from, I didn't have like all these connections where I'm like, I'm going to come and I'm going to like handpick and do this like kind of casting call. So I had to talk to Chipa about it, and he was like, I'm going to give you like 2 or 3 people, we're going to pick them, and like that's what it is. So Then yeah, that was just sort of like what I had. And Ayub turned out to be like this really wonderful person who was, you know, just really fun to talk to. Marcelin was a little bit more like, I think a little bit self-conscious than Ayub. So, like, yeah. But there wasn't like, I didn't go around talking to all of them and choosing like the best person, because you also can't imagine like how someone will respond to a question like that, you know, until like you can't go to everybody's homes and just be like, let's see how this pans out, and then I'll choose the best narration of a dream, you know. So there are limits as well. Yeah.
Right. And also going back to the question of keeping certain moments in the film that were, you know, perhaps awkward or which people usually don't add. Like you added this part where you're setting up also, and we hear आप मतलब questions भी पूछ रही हैं उनसे, or you know, them talking back to you, you talking back to them. Was there a reason you decided to include yourself in the documentary?
Yeah, I think like the one time I really do that was with Marceline, and you know, as I sat with the material more, like, and I've thought about that, there were moments where like Marceline's dream almost seemed like too perfect. Like it had this like perfect religious symbolism to it. And I should also say, like, I'm not interested in like, you know, like tell me like your deepest, darkest like dream as it was. Like all of it is sort of an embellishment and a memory, and the way in which they construct it and maybe add things to it is interesting to me. Just like with the reenactment actors, we all know they're not like A-list actors, right? And it's like the way in which they might fail is interesting to me. The way in which they think that they should reference a certain emotion, the kind of like compelling thing about bad actors is you see the construction, whereas really good actors kind of hide it really well. So with Marceline, I just felt like there were some embellishments that were just too perfect, and I guess I introduced this kind of like clumsy breaking of the fourth wall as a way to sort of like as a sort of reminder that this is a stage that he's on. This is still a stage that we're both on. He's answering questions, and this is not like yeah, that this is just not like a bona fide, like, you know, moment of truth for him. And somehow inserting myself and showing like the setup of the interview helped do that a little bit. That, you know, yeah.
Okay, and I think by including yourself in the film, you also bring in, you know, the presence of the filmmaker and how the film, like, what is this filmmaker compared to the characters? You know, like the presence of the filmmaker. Where's the camera? Who's telling the story? And so, do you see yourself? You know, like, what do you think is the role of the filmmaker in this film? Like, is this you exploring something, you know, wanting to cover a subject matter, or like, you know, where do you think you stand amongst all of this?
I think, well, I mean, I had some idea of like what I wanted to ask, and then sometimes you're just sort of problem solving as a filmmaker for like how to create the best setup for that, and how to be fair, and how to, you know, ask questions in a way or in a place that makes sense or make them feel as comfortable as you possibly can. And I would say actually, like in the case of the reenactment actors, it was a little bit more of like a fly on the wall thing. I was not like a very I was sort of like in the corner filming, because there's so much going on to create that production, and these people kind of don't care that you're there. They're so busy, and they're makeup people and they're costume people, and there's just the whole production team, and the actors like also don't care. Like they're just sort of used to cameras being on them, and they're waiting to like act out their scenes. So I sort of started receding into the background, which allowed me to sort of access certain moments of like preparation or rehearsal, or ways in which they pass their time that I think could have only happened if I sort of like erased myself from there. They also just weren't very interested in my presence. Or like what I was working on. They're very focused on like looking good for the camera that is filming them for this episode. So that was a little bit of my approach there, and that's sort of the presence I took on. With the ambulance drivers, I think I had to be a lot more present. And even though you don't like hear me in the film that much, I was really trying to listen to them and pay attention to what they were saying. And I think subjects or people that you're interviewing, again, they're really smart and they can kind of tell when you're there, just to kind of like, if your curiosity is kind of motivated by other things, you know, and they're very good at picking up intentions, and they're good at figuring out when people are listening earnestly and when they're not. And I think the energy you give gets mirrored back to you. So it was a very different scenario there, where I had to sort of like be the opposite of how I was on the sets. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question from Rashida. She says she especially loved the scene in the room where the camera travels along the wall, the cracked mirror. She says it was mesmerizing. What were you thinking at that time?
That's something that I was not. So that came out in the editing of the film. So it's not like I was there and I was like not paying attention to Marceline and doing something else. So that came out in the editing. I think sometimes there were just moments where when someone's talking, it's just not always necessary to show them talking. And it was much more interesting for me to sort of like focus on other things. Like with Marceline's story, for example, with the Nishtar Park bomb blast, sometimes as a filmmaker, you're sort of like, what the hell could I come up with that could possibly match this story? And like, there are limits again to how much I can empathize to something like this, and it feels really bizarre to try and come up with something that would do it justice. And so there is this kind of like, okay, well, what imagery can I show that would possibly be able to sit with this story? Because I do want to, you know, have this story be told. So then it's like, okay, the ambulance being cleaned, and that was like, it ended up to me being a really like, it's one scene that I really like in the film, where he's kind of going through like the same movements that you would with an ambulance, maybe at the site of something like that, but there's nobody there, and it's just him washing the ambulance. And then with the dream, it just, you know, the china above Marceline and certain decorations in their house, and there's also like a little like ornamental like Muhammad like hanging on the left with the mirror. And so there's just stuff that is telling about where he lives and sometimes who the person is, that is more, just more interesting than like showing them talking and speaking the words. And the material is also very, it sort of becomes very unanchored after a while and goes into this like dream realm. And that's sort of where the challenge was, like, how can I, you know, it wouldn't be that interesting to just fix yourself on the person talking about the dream. So, yeah.
And then there are also, between interviews, there are also a lot of long moments of silence where you just see visuals. What role do you think silence plays in your film? Why did you feel it was necessary to include these moments?
I mean, I think it was a little bit like going back to what I said earlier about I was fascinated by the condition of waiting in the world, the ambulance drivers and the reenactment actors. And I think sometimes, like, just on the side, like something I think about as an artist, as a filmmaker, is like in environments of like precarity or trauma, the way in which even moments of rest are suspect. and not sort of reliable. You can't fully, you're always just a little bit on edge and waiting for the ball to drop. And things get bad really fast, like really badly, really fast. And I think I was like looking back, trying to explore that a little bit with the ambulance drivers, like moments of stillness also being suspect and not fully being moments of rest or idleness. So I think that interest sort of like guided me a little bit. And with the reenactment actors, like it just the world that they produce is so like it's just this like action all the time, and so trying to again like have details emerge from stillness was far more interesting to me in terms of content. And the same with the ambulance drivers. Like I think I just wasn't interested in making a film that was about like all the noise and action of both these jobs. So I started zoning in on moments where they're actually not doing their jobs, but it's saying a little bit more about them and their world than if you were following them on their job,
And I think this story is also very much based in Karachi. People, I think, who are from Karachi can relate to some of the, well, not like at least of like hearing a lot about violence, or like, that story where in the film where I think it was Ayub who says कि अगर मैं तीसरी बार भी कुछ होगा तो फिर मैं ही आपके पास आऊँगा, because he had gone to the same house I think times or 2 times. So but I think in the film I noticed there's no sort of lower thirds context given to Karachi, names. Is there a reason you kind of avoided sort of really adding more context perhaps in the
well, I think like a film like this doesn't, like, exposition doesn't really like help, because it's just not the kind of film that it is. But I think sometimes that's needed, and you kind of sneak that in different ways with films that have like a more like a plot or have a protagonist. So there's that. But I also generally I think this ties a little bit into my previous work as well, where I'm interested in talking about the city without sometimes literally showing it. So I think of it as like a mirror reflecting a mirror reflecting a mirror. Like how can I sort of show Karachi without showing? And when you do see Karachi, but there are moments where it's the water or it's the underpass with the trees. So they're not, they're also moments of stasis, but they're just, they have a different kind of claustrophobia to them. Or you see the bridge, the native jetty bridge. But in my previous work, I made this like short film about Kutta Island, which is, I was fascinated by how there's this island, and the myth is that these dogs were sort of abandoned on it, hundreds of dogs. And there's similar like phenomenon in Turkey, where like 60,000 stray dogs were just shipped to an island to just sort of die, because it was the best way to deal with the stray dog population. And I don't know how I'd heard about the story as a kid, and I was very fascinated by it. But then when I also went there, it was interesting how all of this garbage from, Karachi gets pushed onto, through the waters, gets pushed onto the shores of that island. And so, how to actually not be like in Karachi, but I mean, you are there, but like being on an island and seeing details that tell you about a city without actually like showing, the stuff that we're used to seeing. So yeah, like how to, in this other work, like Dimensions of a Fish, like I'm really just focusing on a whale shark that washes ashore, but how these economies get built around like the whale shark, and these people start trying to sell the whale shark's meat, and they start like those people in the parking lots that are like, I'm going to charge you for parking your car. It was similar. There was several parties ticketing people to come and see the exhibition of the whale shark, and you don't really see the streets, you don't see much of the city, but then when you zone in on this one fish, essentially, like how you can tell the way a city runs, that sort of has fascinated me for a while. Like in the least expected places, how can you or on production sets, how can you like learn and understand like a city?
Yeah, I mean, another insight into the city is again the native jetty bridge that you bring in, and the story connected to that. Jo mujhe laga tha was a little different from the other stories and the other subjects of the film. क्योंकि
Right.
इसमें firstly he wasn't a cheaper ambulance driver, and the woman that he saves was wanting to she
Yeah.
wanted to die. She wanted to drown herself. So this was also interesting to me. Why you included this story? How do you think that adds to?
Yeah, I'm really
your-
glad you like mentioned that, because no one else has brought that up. It's usually like something that falls by the wayside. So that's really insightful.
I thought it was in contrast. It stood out more because it was so different.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Yeah, I think in the hierarchy of things, it's sort of interesting because there are the reenactment actors that are hyper visible, and then there are the ambulance drivers that are acting in an official capacity, right? That's their job, but they're still kind of invisible. And then underneath all of those layers in that pyramid, there's someone like who's a caretaker of a Hindu temple that is completely in an unofficial capacity, voluntarily helping, like, well, it's morally a little bit murky, but he's trying to help these people who are drowning. So it's like the least visible thing out of all of them. And then while the ambulance drivers are all, I think the morality of that is a little bit clear, even as the reenactment show they're like these heroes and these rescuers and these saviors, right? Like, so someone's dead or someone's injured, and it's a little bit black and white. They just kind of go get the person. They're not even trained like to help them. It's just about transporting them. Like, they're these undertakers, and it seems like that's the right thing to do. But with the woman drowning, I think again I wanted to create this like I wanted to complicate it a bit, because it's not they're trying to prevent her from jumping off the boat into the water for a third time. So clearly this person like doesn't want to be saved, right? So like involuntary deaths versus voluntary deaths, and also the complication of Kailash really believing earnestly that that's the right thing to do, and yet like it probably is like not something the woman wanted at all, and the way to get her to just like agree to it was punching her in the face, so
Right.
And the way that her burqa prevents her from drowning, and just these accidental like moments that I thought was an interesting different facet to sort of I guess talk about the city, instead of just like there are people dying, there are people dead, there are people getting rescued, and that's it. So it just kind of complicated the narrative a bit, and it also like asked the question of like whether she should have been saved, so I was trying to explore that.
We have another question from Rashida. She says, I am assuming from the names that the production team were foreigners. If this was the case, how was it working on a Pakistani Karachi-based film with these people? Waise, Rashida, I think as far as I understood, it was all Shehrezad, but I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I had a sound mixer, because that really isn't something that I know how to do. So the sound mixing, I had a very clear picture of what I wanted and what I wanted the sound design to be, and how I wanted to use the music. So it was more like just finding someone with the technical ability to just kind of like help me out. I didn't have those skills. And then a really nice collaboration was with Todd Reynolds, who is a composer here, and he just was like very easy to work with. We both agreed really early on that what the role of music would be in the film, and also that we didn't want to make music that was patronizing or kind of like this sad violin playing in the corner, and also not like overloaded with affectation so that it tells you how to feel. Like sometimes I think music in nonfiction films are like, this is what's happening and this is the script for how you should feel, and it pushes you too much in like one direction, and sometimes that has different effects. It can be orientalizing, it can be essentializing, it can be sort of paternalistic, you know. So I wanted something that kind of like didn't say like, this is the emotion that's the result of this scene, but somehow open up this space where it's not really about coming to a conclusion, you know. And music is delicate that way because it very quickly can like fall into like sad, happy. And so he was able to understand that and just make something really incredible and nuanced that wasn't trying to like paint a picture, you know, of the characters. So yeah, that was, and the rest was it was there might be a few names there, but it was basically the sound mixer and the composer. Yeah, that I
And
had.
did they have any reaction on the film, since it's a very Pakistani, Karachi-based film? So they're just kind of, what was it like working with them on this? Did they have any kind of response to the film or a
Yeah.
perspective on the film that was interesting?
Yeah. So like the guy who did the sound mixing, again, I think it was more of a technical thing. So it you know, you try and explain as much as you can and give context, but and I think it's more of a collaboration if you're not quite sure what you're trying to do, and that person kind of, you're in dialogue with them. But I just really needed someone to help me with the sound mix, and I had a clear picture of what to do. Todd, actually, his projects are quite varied, and the way that I actually discovered him was through These Birds Walk. He did the music for the documentary These Birds Walk. So he like is not completely unfamiliar with like Karachi as a place, and he also has worked a bit with artists, and he does all sorts of different collaborations with people that aren't necessarily filmmakers. He does stuff at Mass Mocha and does stuff like with visual artists that are just in a completely different realm. So he's very versatile, and his politics are really great. So you don't have to like, it doesn't feel as much like you're trying to explain to a white man how to come up with like music for these guys. Like he just kind of got it. But I also think that that's rare, and there are also limits to like how many conversations you can have. Like if someone just doesn't get it and your politics aren't aligning, you know, they can like, you can only explain things so much, right? Like if you're not looking for like run-of-the-mill music, or you're looking for something really specific, you quickly can tell in the beginning of the process when it's not working, I think, with stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it feels like this film is also, a lot of it was probably made on the edit, huh? The way it's kind of structured loosely. Was it, did you have a hard time figuring out, there's no narrative, I guess. Would you say there's a narrative at all in the film?
There are like different narratives that are kind of parallel to each other. But a lot of my work, and I guess this will change a little bit because I'm starting to become a little bit interested in like scripting things, not in documentary, but in a more hybrid fiction documentary way. But a lot of the work just has been born of like, I really love editing. It's a lot of fun for me. And even the previous works, it just, there's material that has really started to make sense when I started editing it. And it was a long process. Like that was like the biggest part of the film. So it was really nice just sitting with the material and just steeping myself in it, and then starting to sort of make connections in the editing room. I also think like when sometimes I feel like as an artist, you follow certain like, you know, things you're interested in, and you can't always articulate to yourself or fix in language why you want to do it. And part of like honing your intuition is figuring out, you know, like the risk, right? Because sometimes you can just follow through with something, not have like language to add to it. And sometimes 3 years later at like 3 a.m. when you're going to get a glass of water, you'll figure out like, oh, that's really what was happening, or that relates to something that happened in my life. And that's part of it. You don't always know. And one thing I feel really protective of as an artist is like, how can you protect that, because it's really hard to keep doing that, to keep like doing things without being able to completely explain why, even to yourself, but it intuitively feels really right, but other people are like, what the hell, it's very difficult to like rally people in that way as well. So yeah, like I think the reason why it sort of comes together in editing is like, for a good while I kind of don't know sometimes myself, like why I was curious about something, and you have to be able to figure that out if you want to start working with the material. So
yeah, there are definitely some interesting images that kind of state, like there's that image of I'm not sure where, if I'm correct in knowing where it's from, is that image of like that house and there's like a fence, and it reminded me of that, when you go to get your eyesight
yeah,
checked.
that's it.
Like,
That's
it's that image, right?
yeah.
Very
Yeah.
similar. Yeah.
It
So
is
it took me a while to figure out where this is from because it looked so familiar.
and it's
Yeah.
so familiar to me because I get my eyes checked like every 6 months, and in Karachi it was always the same house. At one point it was like a Ferrari car or something on a racetrack,
Right.
but it's still the house, so
Yeah.
again, like that's just something that I wasn't even working on those projects at the time. I was just sort of like, that image has kind of been stuck in my head. I want to film it, and then you film it, and I just collect a lot of things. So I had that like on a hard drive, not really knowing like how I would use it, and then it just sort of fell into place. I don't think you can really go out and like set to film those things, because it's an accumulation of like many things you've collected over time. And then to me it sort of feels like, like that winter coat you've forgotten about, and like 2 seasons later you open it up and there's all this junk in your pockets that you forgot about, and there are these tickets from like a film you went to see, and you have this like rush of nostalgia, like there are moments that I wanted to sort of recreate that feeling, if that makes sense, and I don't think you can seek out to like arrange that, or pre-plan it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I don't think we have any more questions coming in, so we're probably gonna end soon. Do you have any shooting, like a day that stood out, something that stood out while shooting, an interesting experience?
I mean, yeah, like I think it's the moment I described to you earlier, where you immediately knew what I was talking about when I said I was filming the arena. He was like, "Yeah, I go there." So that was sort of like a really. I had just not imagined that at all, and that kind of changed the direction that the filming took. So that stood out to me. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And are you working on anything right now? Do you have any future projects that are kind of ongoing?
Yeah, I'm working on something right now, but I think I need to talk to a lawyer, like a creative, so I'm building this archive of like particular moments that happen in like several different films, and building a narrative out of that, but I just need to figure out if it's legal. So it's like found footage then, I guess. And then I'm also becoming more interested in like writing, like partially like writing scripts for things I might film in the future. And I mean, a lot has changed, like, yeah, so I don't think I'll make documentaries, and that's not really, I don't know what direction the future work will take, but that's sort of where I am right now.
Is there a reason why you got into document? Because your background is art, right?
I don't know anymore. Like I've become really like really fallen in love with film in the last 5 years. Like I wasn't, I hate the term, but I wasn't like a cinephile. I didn't really know much about films in the last 5 years. If you asked me 10 years ago, like who's your favorite filmmaker or whatever, I would be able to tell you who my favorite artist was, but I didn't know much about film. And in the last 5 or 6 years, I've really fallen in love with cinema, and I feel increasingly uncomfortable saying like, oh, I'm a visual artist, and I'm also not comfortable saying like I'm a documentary filmmaker. And I think, as you might know, like the project it wouldn't exist in an art installation. But you also, like, the way film festivals work is that, you know, you get slotted in very quickly through a process of elimination. It's either a fiction film or it's a documentary, and there are very few places that program for stuff in the middle. So I didn't like set out to make a documentary. Like, it's more of a experimental nonfiction film, but that's how you have to present it, because those are the platforms, you know. So maybe I'll make another experimental nonfiction film.
Sure.
Like
I think by you know, changing the rules a little bit and calling it a documentary, then perhaps increases one's understanding of what a documentary can potentially be also.
Yeah, and I think that happened for me too. Like, I've watched more documentaries that it was a genre that I didn't think I really loved, and I've seen so many really beautifully done films. Like, I don't even think I personally could like do cinema verite documentaries, but I've discovered so many that are amazing, you know. So there's just a lot of new information that I've gathered and gotten excited about, and I think more and more, like, the film festivals that it has shown in, they do seem to like include more visual artists that accidentally landed up in documentary land, you know. So it is. I'm also getting a sense of who kind of curates work like that, but I do still think that the visual art world and the film world are very compartmentalized, and that's sort of unfortunate. Like, the discourses happening in both those universes are very divorced from each other.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Shehrezad,
Thank you so
coming
much.
and chatting with us. And this was a really great documentary. I thought it's really interesting. It really makes you think about all the ways that you can depict and represent violence and trauma. And I think it's one of those where you can maybe watch it a few times and kind of pick out certain details that then kind of make you look at it a little differently.
That means a lot. Thank you so much. And thanks for making the time to talk and to engage with it. It means a lot. Thank you.
No, this is really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone else for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed ये वाला session. और अब हम लोग का ये second last screening थी हमारी, और अगली screening होगी हमारी 29th को, जो Sunday होगा मेरे ख्याल में, Saturday नहीं होगा. तो प्लीज़ 2 हफ्ते में आप ट्यून इन करिएगा हमारे, आप पेज को सब्सक्राइब करें YouTube पे भी और Instagram पे भी हमें फॉलो करें, तो 2 हफ्ते में आपको पता चल जाएगा कि हमारी अगली फिल्म कौन सी है. और या थैंक यू फॉर बीइंग पार्ट ऑफ आवर फेस्टिवल. थैंक यू
everyone.
ओके, खुदा हाफिज़. बाय.